And again, if it's already been covered, forgive me, but for my purposes, I want to be able to ask these questions. But it's still true that no independent examination outside of the DC Medical Examiner's Office has been conducted. Is that correct?
To my knowledge, yes, that's correct.
And why is that problematic? Just in short order, why is that? Why do you see that as a problem?
Because there are very likely federal crimes that have been committed here, and the DOJ is spending their time instead prosecuting and jailing my friends for totally peaceful, nonviolent direct action, when instead they should be going after killers who are committing federal crimes.
And so on that point, right, I mean, what we have is that a spokeswoman from the DC police stated that the determination was based on the on-scene investigation conducted by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, correct?
That's correct.
Right, but nothing else. And not to harp on it, but I just want this to be clear for the record, because people need to know that, and that there's a bit of a conflict of interest there, with that being the only source for whether the laws were followed, correct?
Yes.
And specifically to what you said, and again, forgive me if it's repeating anything that was discussed earlier, we believe, based on the information before us now, in terms of what you all have been able to uncover, that there's virtually no way that the laws were actually followed, and that in fact there was evidence of late-term abortion, correct?
Yes, late-term abortion in and of itself isn't necessarily
Right.
a federal crime, but leaving a baby to die after they've been born is, and so is partial birth abortion, and those seem extremely likely for at least 3 of the DC-5.
And can you, again, if this has been covered, forgive me, can you explain, for my purposes, specifically why you believe that?
The two that are in totally intact condition, they were very old in terms of their gestational age. They were very advanced. We're looking at, experts have put them around 30 weeks or more.
Which, as you said, late term isn't itself necessarily a crime.
Right.
But go ahead.
But leaving a baby to die after they've been born alive is. Now, I explained in my opening statement that without the use of feticides, a feticidal injection like digoxin, according to pro-choice sources like the Society of Family Planning and the University of Vienna, the rate of infants being born alive, if they are induced medically, like through a labor induction, is 50%. So that automatically raises the question of what happens if they are born alive. And the abortion provider that works at the Washington Surgery Center has actually said on camera about 10 years ago that if that happened, that he would not help the baby in that case. So we have very strong reason to believe that any babies that are medically induced in his practice that are born alive don't leave that facility alive.
What do you believe should be the next step in investigating and pursuing the truth?
I think Congress should subpoena the bodies of the babies. They should subpoena Lauren to come testify. I believe that Santangelo should testify, and there should be very thorough hearings.
Switching topics for the sake of time, we can always come back. Quick question. You and I have discussed in the past, you don't come at this from a particular ideological perspective, do you? Or maybe you do, but let me just put it this way. You and I aren't necessarily politically aligned on a lot of issues. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The point being, your perspective and what you have here is not being driven by any political ideology. Is that a fair characterization?
That's a fact.
But rather a concern for life.
Yes.
So I said that as a precedent now for both of you, for questions that you might have expertise on, and Mr. Dryden, you might have more on this case. But in general terms, and a lot have been asked about NIH and some of the issues involved, and obviously the universities, and Ms. Green covered that pretty thoroughly. Again, not sure if you already covered this, but I'm concerned about federal dollars and what they're being used for and where they're being directed and where they're headed. So do you all have any way to characterize the extent to which or how much taxpayer money the NIH has spent on what I'll characterize broadly as fetal experimentation, say within the last year or over the last 5 years or some other framework? And again, forgive me if you've covered this already.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Either one of you.
Sure. So, so as Teresa mentioned pointed out in her opening statement, actually, just in the past year, for the most recent numbers that the NIH self-reports, they spent $57 million on fetal experimentation. I have serious concerns that the NIH's public reporting of those numbers are not accurate, because there are plenty of examples that my organization and other citizen researchers have uncovered where there were either major NIH grants or major research studies published using aborted fetal body parts, or other fetal experimentation projects that we have examples of, where the NIH grants that supported them are not included in that public NIH database on the NIHreport.gov website. So, for example, we've been talking about the baby scalping experiment at the University of Pittsburgh. That was supported by multiple NIH grants, one of them from Dr. Fauci's NIAID office. Those grants are not reported in the NIH human fetal tissue categorization on the nih.report.gov website. And that's just one very prominent example. They were using NIH grants to scalp 5-month-old babies and stitch the scalps onto lab rats, and that's for some reason not categorized as a human fetal experimentation project. So I think that, there were.
So that's not, to be clear, categorized in what you described in a minute ago as the $57 million number. Is that an annual figure?
Correct. That's what I'm saying.
So you're saying a $57 million annual figure that presumably flows through and from HHS funding predominantly,
yeah,
which, by the way, is on the docket to be voted on this week. I would point out to my colleagues generally, but particularly my Republican colleagues. So that $57 million annual amount is not inclusive of what you just described as an observation with respect to NIAID and Fauci and what we just talked about with the scalps. Is that correct?
Correct. It does not seem to capture all of the fetal experimentation money that's being spent.
That's 57 million I think we could cut.
I think that's right. Do you have anything to add to any of that with respect to the taxpayer funding or any of that?
It's 57 million is actually one of the lowest years. If there were some years, I think on that chart that I showed, where it was like well over 100 million. So, but I think that David's point is really important, that they are hiding some of that money, and we need to make sure that there is oversight to that.
So to be clear, and I'll pass it back over, is in addition to whatever Congress is voting on this week in particular, we've got about half of our budget, Department of Defense, State and Foreign Operations, we've got HHS and other Department of Homeland Security. There are significant measures that we will be voting on that are abortion related, specifically abortion tourism at the Pentagon, for example. But this is, we're talking about here in terms of experimentation, which is beyond funding the abortion industry specifically for carrying out abortions or marketing or do whatever they're doing to carry out abortions, but rather the experimentation that's going on with this industry broadly. I'm trying to clarify for the record that this is what we're funding. So when we vote on this stuff, these are the kinds of things we're voting to fund. And I think that merits a great deal of focus for our colleagues. So I appreciate that. Last question for you, Mr. Lyden. I was the first Assistant Attorney General in Texas in 2015. And you might understand why that is a year that is important. I had to sit and watch a lot of videos, all of them that we had in our possession. One of the things that has been raised over the years by my colleagues and others and obviously was litigated in court, was the question of the veracity of the findings by virtue of the methods by which the information was acquired. Can you just speak a little bit to that about what has been uncovered and the methods to uncover them and the veracity of what was uncovered, irrespective of some of the allegations or characterizations of it? If that makes sense?
Sure. Yeah. At the end of the day, the video camera doesn't lie. The footage that I and my fellow undercover investigators recorded was recorded on police quality, law enforcement quality undercover equipment. And we provided all of we've provided all of that footage to certainly to Congress under subpoena and to other law enforcement agencies when they requested it. Planned Parenthood has actually stipulated in a sworn court stipulation that the individuals captured and recorded on the footage did indeed speak the words that they are recorded speaking on the video footage, and these people, I think the Planned Parenthood officials who are shown on the tapes ought to be, ought to themselves be subpoenaed and be questioned under oath about their statements. There's been a little bit of that done so far in deposition testimony and other work, some of which is actually public, which CMP has reported on. And it's very interesting once you put the leadership of the abortion industry under oath and you show them these tapes and you ask them about those talking points about saying, heavily edited, which I still don't know what that means. The subtitles were too big, or we put the subtitles on the tapes were too bold or something. But you ask them about those talking points and they backtrack pretty quickly when they're under oath because the video camera doesn't lie.
Thank you. And I'll say, anything to add to the methods with respect to finding some of this information and what you all, have had to do in the same category, and that this stuff's coming to light because of those actions. Anything you have to add about those methods?
I think it's just absolutely shameful that over the last 8 years, we have had to battle with these universities over records requests, that we have had to do all of this investigation as private citizens when the DOJ has had all of this information all along. The DOJ knows that fetal tissue research relies on born alive infants in some cases, and yet there has been no action taken. So that has been incredibly frustrating, but that's why this moment is so important to David and I, the fact that we are finally getting this on the congressional record and hopefully move this forward and get some justice for these children.
Last question, I promise. FACE Act.
Repeal it.
So you have 3 supporters of doing that here, I'm sure. But can you just articulate, and this is the final question, articulate the extent to which the FACE Act has been used politically to target certain individuals versus others, and how that has impacted you all? And again, forgive me if it's repetitive.
Yeah, the FACE Act was enacted in '94 to suppress pro-life activism. Ultimately, it was a response to everyday Americans going to abortion facilities, places where the killing is happening, while the killing is happening, and putting their bodies in between the killers and the baby. And the FACE Act was very effective in shutting down that type of activism because it basically made pro-life activism a federal crime. And my colleagues are literally in jail right now under the FACE Act for totally nonviolent, peaceful sit-ins that are similar to many other social justice movements. And those people are not facing these kinds of charges. And the FACE Act was originally pitched to protect churches and pregnancy centers as well. But what we're seeing is the total weaponization of this law, that it has been used hundreds of times against peaceful pro-lifers. And I think it's been used twice against violent pro-abortion activists. So there's just a total unequal application of this law. It was designed to oppress us. It is oppressing us. And pro-life activism should be legal in this country again.
Is it right that it's about 130 something to maybe 3 roughly under the Biden administration? Isn't that roughly correct in terms of FACE Act applications directed towards pro-lifers versus other?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Wow, that's a staggering